We'll end at 6. So it's a real pleasure to welcome for the first time to the new school, as far as I know, Professor Erin Thompson, whose website, I can't resist reading you the first sentence of her self-description, as America's only professor of art crime. So we don't know if there's one in Germany or Japan. There might be. As America's only professor of art crime, Professor Thompson studies the black market for looted antiquities, museum collections of human remains, and I want to say the problem of collecting, which is the first book, really, really interesting problem. Controversial public monuments, art made by detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and a variety of other overlaps between art and crime. So I'll just mention the 2 books that have already been published. One is Smashing Statues from 2022, The Rise and Fall of America's Public Monuments, which has been widely reviewed and discussed and is making a splash, as they say. And then prior to that, as I mentioned, a history of private collections called Possession from 2016, and currently at work on a book about art and forgery. So it's a real pleasure to have you close out for us our week here at the Institute for Philosophy and New Humanities.
Thank you. So in 2023, I published this book on the history of American monuments, which asks questions about how America got the monuments we have and why so many people are protesting or removing some of them now. And today I'm delighted to take this opportunity to discuss with you what modern iconoclasts are doing, what relationships between image and ideas they are enacting. To set up this discussion, the first section of my talk will give you an example of a history of a monument and its destruction, a history that I didn't include in my book because it was still ongoing and indeed is still unfolding. And after that, I want to think about the relationship between AI and iconoclasm through the lens of spirit photography, the later 19th and early 20th century belief that photographs could capture manifestations of the spirits of the dead. My great thanks go to the conveners of this workshop for inviting me to discuss these topics with you, and I hope I will not make them immediately regret their invitation by beginning with an erotic dream. Llewellyn, king of the Welsh in the mid-11th century, had a beautiful wife whom he loved more than she loved him. That is, according to Walter Map, the chronicler who recorded this story about a century after the death of the historic Llewellyn. The king learned that a handsome, wealthy young nobleman had dreamed about having sex with the queen. As enraged as if the thing had been real, the king demanded that the young man be penalized. The law demanded that someone in the position of this wealthy young man should surrender 1,000 kine to the king, sheep, goats, cows, domesticated animals, which would have consumed this man's fortune. But should this heavy penalty be imposed upon someone who had slept with the queen only in a dream? The wisest sage in Wales was finally consulted about this question and told the young man to lead 1,000 animals along the banks of a lake on a sunny day in the presence of the king. The young man could then go home with his animals, while Llewellyn could keep the shadows he had seen on the waters. Because, as the sage explained, a dream is a shadow, in the original Latin, an umbra of the truth. Thus, a punishment in shadows is fitting for an offense committed in a dream. Of course, before we take this as information about medieval beliefs about the nature of images, we have to keep in mind that Walter Map included this story in a book of entertainments, which also includes discussions of vampires, fairies, and mermen, which Map compiled for the amusement of the court of the English King Henry II. Here, speaking of shadows and shades, is an illustration of Map drawn several generations after his death by someone who likely never saw an image of him. Map's De Nugis Curialium is indeed entertaining. I recommend it, especially in the translation by the Oxford medievalist and weird tales writer M.R. James. But his contents are difficult to interpret. Many of the stories seem to be satirical, but what does it mean to mock a king in a book written for a king about his inability both to tell a dream from truth and to enact his punishment of choice? These are interesting questions, but I'm bringing up the story of Llewellyn and the dream because it seemed to me to be a good preparation for thinking about iconoclasm and AI. If we think of iconoclasm as an attack intended to change something in our world, how can it operate against an AI-generated image with no identifiable maker or referent? How can iconoclasm operate against an umbra, a shadow, or a shade? And do our reactions to an image somehow change its status? Does Llewellyn's reaction to a dream, with all the emotion that would arise from actually discovering his wife with a lover, tell us anything about recent cases of the users of AI-enabled apps who believe themselves to be in loving relationships with a generated character, a character generated from the probabilistic interpretation of their own inputted desires? To start thinking about questions like this, I'll begin with my definition of iconoclasm, which is a performance that communicates to an audience that the social, political, religious, or other power held by the entity that created the attacked image is weaker than this audience imagined. In other words, iconoclasm, I think, is not primarily an attack on an image, but an attack on an intangible idea carried out through an attack on a tangible proxy. This is why I call it a performance, because it occurs in the tangible realm in an effort to change something in the intangible realm. It's more like leading sheep along the banks of a lake than we might like to admit. Beliefs about the directness of the relationship between the proxy image and its referent have changed greatly over time, because several ancient cultures seem to have believed there is a direct relationship between portraits and their subjects, such that an attack on an image could be an attack on the body itself. Hence, we find royal portraits like this one that have been attacked by conquering forces. Here, this Assyrian king, made around the 22nd century BCE, has had his eyes gouged out, his ears clipped, and his nose flattened. Even if those who attacked the king through his image, we might even say tortured him, believed that their blows landed on the king himself, whether living or in the afterlife, though these attacks still served to demonstrate that the conquered rulers no longer had any power to punish such acts of lèse-majesté. I would also see the habit of the Romans, of what modern scholars term damnatio memoriae, the practice of destroying all portraits of people deemed to be enemies of the state after their death, as a midway point in the loosening belief in the directness of the harm. There seems to be some surviving idea that the eradication of someone's image could have an impact on their experience in the afterlife, but the practicalities of the practice demonstrate people also understood it as a way of reformulating the understanding of the attacked subject's place in history and as a way of pledging allegiance to a new order. For example, this wooden tondo painted in Egypt around the 2nd century CE shows the emperor Septimius Severus, his wife, and his son Caracalla, all with cheerful smiles and delightfully bulging eyes. And a scrubbed-off circle of gray floats beside the face of Caracalla. This was once the Gita, Septimius Severus's other son, whom he appointed to be co-emperor with Caracalla. The evil Caracalla soon ordered Gita assassinated and his memory erased. Someone in provincial Egypt, far from the capital, was eager to comply with this pronouncement to demonstrate his loyalty to Caracalla. By contrast, an emperor could also win a sort of posthumous popularity contest and be deified. If you're interested, of the around 70 emperors from Augustus to Constantine, 25 were deified and 26 had their memories condemned. Even iconoclastic episodes that were ostensibly motivated by religious beliefs were also often deeply tied to attacks on political power. Thus, art historians, including David Friedberg, have shown that the leaders of iconoclastic episodes in the Netherlands during the Protestant Reformation were often members of the minor nobility who used the smashing of images in Catholic churches as a symbol and rallying point for their rebellion against the rule of their territory by Catholic Spanish monarchs. So this brings us precipitously to modern iconoclasm, which is interesting even though its actual prevalence has been greatly exaggerated in the public mind. A little more than 200 public monuments in the US, less than 0.5% of the total number, were taken down after the death of George Floyd sparked the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. The great majority of these removals were official, carried out by local authorities, and some were even intended to ensure the safety of these sculptures to protect them from protesters. Other monuments were merely moved to less conspicuous locations or returned to their donors or sold to interested parties, and some of these have been re-erected on private land, as this sculpture of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, which now graces a golf course in Texas. Protesters, on the other hand, pulled down less than 20% of all of these removed monuments, accounting for something like, by my count, 13 Confederate monuments and 22 monuments to other controversial figures. Most of these sculptures also remain in storage, ready for repair or even perhaps reinstallation in what I still cannot believe the New York Times allowed me to say in print was America's Strategic Racism Reserve. As far as I'm aware, only 3 of the 214 removed monuments have been irrevocably destroyed. I'm showing you here the process of one of these cases, when in November 2020, a sculptor chipped the face off a roughly serving platter-sized portrait of Columbus that had adorned the side of a 1992 monument to Italian immigrants in Norwich, Connecticut. Instead of replacing the entire monument, the city's Italian Heritage and Cultural Committee thriftily ordered Columbus smoothed down and replaced with a new plaque carved with intertwined Italian and American flags. This equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee, placed in downtown Charlottesville in 1924, met a much more dramatic fate. I'll spend this chunk of time in my talk talking about the history of this sculpture, since I think knowing how and why it was created and maintained is crucial to understand why it was opposed and ultimately destroyed. The monument was a gift to the city of Charlottesville from Paul McIntyre. After making his fortune as a stockbroker in Chicago, McIntyre retired to Charlottesville, his hometown, inspired by the City Beautiful movement, as well as by the desire of the city's wealthy white residents to make the downtown blocks into a cultivated, tranquil, and white-only space. McIntyre purchased and donated to the city land to be used in the creation of 5 parks. A substantial amount of these blocks had been occupied by thriving Black residences and businesses, which were acquired and demolished through eminent domain. McIntyre also commissioned and donated several monuments to the city, one of which was this one. He commissioned it from a New York sculptor, Henry Schrady. When Schrady died, the project was taken over by an assistant whose finished work has usually been regarded as awkward and unrealistic. As early as 1923, when Virginia newspapers ran photographs of the finished model for the statue, an indignant letter to the editor from a Confederate veteran complained that the sculpture not only, quote, signally failed to reproduce General Lee as he actually was, but that the monument's restless, dramatic horse bore no resemblance to Lee's famed mount, a horse named Traveler, quote, who was not a horse to put on airs. Here's a daguerreotype of Traveler, if you want to make your own decision. Few people have ever thus praised this sculpture as an artistic accomplishment. From the beginning, the Lee Monument would be praised, attacked, and defended on very different grounds than the artistic. I think a wider look at race relations in America as a whole, and Virginia in particular in this period, is necessary to understand why the Charlottesville elite were so invested in creating this monumental celebration of a Confederate general, which went up, after all, more than a half century after the end of the Civil War. The timing of the commission seems to recall then current racial tensions that erupted following World War I, when Black men who thought they had proved their equality and worth by their wartime service returned home to find things unchanged. Sporadic revolts and strikes erupted in what became known as the Red Summer of 1990, when white mobs attacked Black individuals or neighborhoods during nearly 40 race riots. In Charlottesville, Virginia, these tensions took shape in an early and enthusiastic adoption of the revived Ku Klux Klan. In June 1921, for instance, the local newspaper admiringly reported that during the Klan's first cross-burning ceremony in Charlottesville, Quote, hundreds of Charlottesville's leading business and professional men participated in a midnight ceremony, sealing the pledge of chivalry and patriotism with the deepest crimson of American blood. By 1922, University of Virginia students, the UVA is located in Charlottesville, had formed their own branch of the Klan, and in 1924, the Charlottesville courthouse hosted a Klan meeting. Those who celebrated white supremacy weren't content to let ceremonies and sporadic violence bear the whole burden of racial oppression, of course. So instead, a small but dedicated group of Virginians set out to enshrine discrimination even further into state law. Virginia's Black citizens had been effectively disenfranchised by a 1902 Jim Crow era revision of the state constitution, which required poll taxes and literacy tests. But this wasn't good enough for a man named John Powell. In July 1923, Powell published an essay in the Richmond Times-Dispatch with the rhetorical question, as its title, "Is White America to Become a Negroid Nation?" Powell opened his essay by describing standing on a street corner in Richmond and examining those who walked past him. He claimed he had counted among these passersby over 200 Negroes, of whom only 5 were Black. He also recorded the existence of over 30 individuals, of whom I could not with any degree of certainty state whether they were white or colored. This is a little weird, but what's going on is that in a manner echoing contemporary panics about trans or gender nonconforming bathroom use or sports teams participation, Powell and a number of other of white Virginians in the early 1920s were convinced that the color line was eroding. How could you enforce segregation if you couldn't tell who was who, if Black people could pass for white? Powell and his allies, eager to find justifications for continued denial of restriction of political participation, economic opportunity, and quality healthcare and schooling, seized on a new scientific theory, or at least one coming to new prominence in the US, eugenics. The University of Virginia had become a leading center for this pseudoscience in 1900, when this man, Professor Paul Barringer, published what would prove to be one of eugenics' key texts, The American Negro, His Past and Future. According to Barringer, Black Americans had reached their highest developmental potential under slavery, when benevolent white masters imposed selective breeding to improve their savage nature. Barringer argued that after emancipation, Black Americans returned to barbarism as natural as the return of the sow that is washed to her wallowing in the mire. He did, however, have to, in his book, admit that at least some Black Americans had what he called exceptional character, since one of his half-brothers, Warren Clay Coleman, born into slavery, founded a successful textile mill and would have probably been the wealthiest Black man in North Carolina by the time Barringer published his screed. Barringer insisted that Black people were genetically more susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis, and thought that the whole race would go extinct fairly rapidly. But before this inevitable extinction, however, he believed that Black Americans posed a public health threat to white Americans, worrying, for example, that tubercular Black cooks might contaminate the food of their employers. I need to point out that this is indeed an irrational system where white Americans, although supposedly superior, are surprisingly fragile. John Powell enthusiastically adopted these eugenicist theories. In his 1923 essay, Powell wrote that it is, quote, not enough to segregate the Negro on railway trains and streetcars, in schools and theaters. It is not enough to restrict his exercise of the voting franchise so long as the possibility remains of the absorption of Negro blood into our white population. Powell had a fix for this problem. Virginia should issue its citizens racial certificates, punishing misrepresentations as a felony. Then local clerks could scrutinize these certificates before issuing marriage licenses so that no one with any trace whatsoever of any blood other than the Caucasian could marry a white person. In early 1924, Virginia did exactly this, passing the frankly named Racial Integrity Act, which made only a few changes to Powell's proposal. Intermarriage had long been illegal in Virginia, but the 1924 Act tightened the prohibition by defining someone as non-white if they had any amount whatsoever of non-white ancestry, and required every Virginian to have a certificate on file with the Bureau of Vital Statistics to report their race. Dr. Walter Plecker, son of the Confederate veteran and director of this Bureau of Vital Statistics, was convinced that thousands of what he called near-white people lived in Virginia, and he was so enthusiastic about his new powers under the Act that he even sought to exhume the bodies of people now deemed colored from white cemeteries. The Act had a number of far-reaching consequences, including solidifying the segregated healthcare system of Charlottesville. Black residents could now only obtain treatment in the separate basement ward of the University of Virginia Teaching Hospital, and this was the case well into the 1950s. The logic seemed to be that if Black people were more susceptible to disease, there was little point in being especially attentive to treating them, and this assumption carried out its own statistics. So, for example, 72.6% of the Black patients with syphilis in Charlottesville died in 1936, compared with only 7.2% of the white patients in the year. 3 months after the 1924 Racial Integrity Act passed, the Lee Monument was unveiled. To celebrate the statue's arrival, the Klan burned a cross and then marched through the city to the sound of a brass band. Lee was an important, indeed a crucial talking point for the eugenicists, both as they lobbied for the act and afterwards, when they educated Virginians about their new responsibilities. A comprehensive eugenicist campaign would require personal sacrifice, after all. For example, if someone like Plecker declared that your family was colored after scrutinizing long-forgotten branches of your family tree. Thus, eugenicists praised Lee and pressed him into service as an example of what they wanted to achieve. For example, a 1934 Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Lee claimed that it took 5 generations of clean living and wise mating to produce such a man. The author insisted that there were not more than 2 or 3 instances when one of Lee's ancestors had married someone not equal in blood. This lack of misalliance made Lee's career, quote, eugenically a lesson in the cumulative effect of generations of wise marriages. The Lees were made into examples of an imaginary American race, supposedly descended from the founders of the first colonies. Eugenicists regarded these Americans as even better than white Europeans, since they were both brave enough to cross the ocean and hardy enough to survive. The Lee family's long history of political power and military command was also used as evidence, as proof that qualities like intelligence and leadership were genetic. It's ironic that Lee himself was obsessed with his own heredity, although in a very different way than those celebrating the Declaration of the Monument imagined. Lee's father had followed an early heroic career as one of General Washington's Revolutionary War cavalry officers, with a descent in later life into speculation and fraud. He eventually abandoned his family and fled the country. Lee's private writings showed that he considered his own life to be an unceasing fight to resist what he saw as his own tainted heritage. But Charlottesville Lee statue had a very different message. It was meant to teach white viewers to breed wisely and to fear what might happen if they did not. The act was still disrupting lives in the early morning of July 11th, 1958, when Virginian police burst into the bedroom of this couple, Mildred and Richard Loving, and arrested them for evading the law by getting married in another state. It was not until 1967, in the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court case, that the act was overturned. In March 2016, Zana Bryant, then a high school freshman, sent a petition to Charlottesville City Council. She asked them to remove the bronze statue of Robert E. Lee from the park in the city's center. "I am offended every time I pass it," she wrote. "I am reminded over and over again of the pain of my ancestors." Bryant's petition was part of a wave of calls to reconsider the public use of Confederate imagery following the June 2015 murder of 9 Black worshipers at Charleston, Virginia's Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church by a white suprematist hoping to start a race war. Before the shooting, the killer had visited a Confederate graveyard and the Museum and Library of Confederate History, and the white supremacist manifesto he posted online to justify these killings was illustrated with photographs he took at these sites, along with another of him holding both a Confederate flag and a gun. In the months following the murders, public outcry led to the removal of the Confederate flag from official use in several states, as well as the decision to remove 4 Confederate monuments from New Orleans. Charlottesville's mayor soon appointed a commission of local experts to consider the fate of the Lee Monument. Jolene Schmidt, a University of Virginia professor of religious studies, attended the first of these hearings. She remembered that city staffers up on stage had outnumbered the 10 or so people in the audience, and that most of these audience members were white and had come to say that the monuments should remain in place. Schmidt, who is biracial, knew that 52% of the population of Charlottesville during the Civil War were enslaved Black Americans, and thus regarded the Lee Monument as a lie from the time it was put in, since the majority of the community was elated when Union troops came. That is, Schmidt thought that the Lee Monument lied about Charlottesville's support of the Confederacy, since the majority of the city had greeted the war as marking their freedom rather than their defeat. Schmidt began to talk to the few other audience members who had also come to question why a monument to a man who had fought to preserve slavery was in the center of town, and soon they began encouraging others to attend. The audience of the final meeting was filled with hundreds of people of all racial identities wearing T-shirts with the slogan, "We stand with the 52%. Finally, in late 2016, the commission issued a report asking the city to move the Lee Monument to a less prominent location in a park dedicated to Paul McIntyre, where its meaning could be transformed through interpretive signage. The city council approved this plan in early 2017. But within a few weeks, various pro-Confederate heritage groups had sued the city to block the move, arguing that a state law meant that local authorities didn't have the power to move or touch the monument. The judge in this case issued an injunction that essentially kept the monument nailed to its pedestal for the next 5 years. Meanwhile, perhaps in reaction to the lawsuit, or perhaps reconsidering what it would mean to re-erect a statue in another public space, the city council reconsidered the issue and voted to change the plan. Now, instead of merely moving Lee, they would remove it and sell the statue to a buyer. These events might have remained a local matter, concerning as they do only 2 out of the tens of thousands of the public monuments in the United States. They were considering both the Lee Monument and another similar McIntyre monument to Stonewall Jackson. But the summer of 2017 was volatile. The murders in Charleston had brought public attention to the relation of Confederate memorialization to contemporary white supremacy, and the election of Trump to the presidency was taken by some groups as an encouragement to enter public life more openly in support of white supremacy. Charlottesville's monuments became a convenient rallying point for several of these groups, beginning in May 2017, when the white supremacist Richard B. Spencer, who had graduated from the University of Virginia, convened a rally around one of the statues and then led a torchlight march to the other, to the Lee statue. Spencer's speech at this rally insisted that white Americans were being displaced by multicultural forces who would treat them as they wanted to treat the monument. Quote, "They want to put us in a museum in the sense that they want to neuter us. They want to take away who we are. They want to take away our heritage, but much more important than our heritage, our future." Spencer insisted that instead of living in a world of equality, he wanted to live in a world of gods and heroes like Robert E. Lee. "I want to live in a world of white men who created our civilization." Spencer and his contemporary white supremacists would nod along to a lecture by Powell or Berenger or Plecker. Their talk of white genocide and fears of being replaced are direct echoes of the eugenicist paranoia about white America becoming a Negroid nation. Jason Kessler, a conservative blogger from Charlottesville, then organized a larger rally to protest the planned removal of the Lee Monument for August 2017, dubbing it the Unite the Right rally. As one of the leaders explained, the Lee Monument was the focal point because it would be about white genocide, about the replacement of our people culturally and ethnically. The Unite the Right rally dissolved into chaos before it even began. and a white nationalist drove his car through a group of anti-racist counter-protesters, killing an activist named Heather Hare and injuring 19 others. The city council voted to mourn this violence by covering the Lee statue with a black shroud. After the plaintiffs in the lawsuit about its fate complained that this decision meant that the public's right to view the statues was obstructed by what they called in their filing giant trash bags, the judge ordered the shrouds removed. Schmidt and the other activists disagreed with the plaintiffs' contention that the state laws prevented the statue's removal, but they understood that the law was hazy enough in its wording to leave the issue in doubt. Thus, they began what was ultimately a successful campaign to change this law. Schmidt, along with Andrea Douglas, the executive director of the Jefferson School, a local nonprofit working on preserving Charlottesville's Black history, also began to think about what should happen to this statue after its removal. They didn't want to repeat the fate of another Confederate monument that had stood in front of Charlottesville's courthouse until recently, until 2020, when the county authorities had removed it and given it to a nonprofit who had re-erected it in a Civil War battlefield nearby. Schmidt and Douglas didn't want the Lee to be put back on display elsewhere where it could still serve to glory the Confederacy, and thus the Swords into Plowshares project was born. The Jefferson School created a proposal to acquire the Lee monument, melt it down, and commission an artist to use the bronze to create a new public monument. In April 2021, the Supreme Court of Virginia finally ruled on the lawsuit, holding that the city council had always had the power to do what they wished with this monument, and the statue was finally removed. The city collected proposals from interested parties who would be granted the monument if they displayed it in a manner that would question its history and reject Confederate nostalgia. And in the meantime, as the proposals came in, the sculpture was trucked to storage in a public works department lot where it lay next to piles of compost. The Jefferson School was the only local nonprofit to put in a bid, and it was awarded the monument by unanimous vote of the city council. The companion monument to Stonewall Jackson was awarded to LAX Arts, who then commissioned the artist Kara Walker to transform it into an artwork that's set to be revealed in Los Angeles in October, next month. When contractors from the Jefferson School came to cart away the monument, they applied industrial strength lubricant to the joints between its torso and the horse's legs, which are stuck into the torso like pegs. And Schmidt told me she recalled that the statue came apart fast with just a little strategic wiggling because its makers hadn't ever thought it necessary to bolt it together. They couldn't or didn't want to imagine a future where those who controlled the city wouldn't want to keep it up. After weathering yet another lawsuit by a group of new plaintiffs who sought to reverse the reward and asked the court to either weld the statue back together or, if it was already irreparable, to cast the bronze into Civil War cannon for placement on historical battlefields, literally proposing to make weapons out of monuments instead of melt swords into plowshares. The destruction finally proceeded in October 2023. I was lucky enough to be invited as one of the few observers. Schmidt and Douglas had wanted to make the ceremony for the destruction as public and impactful as the ceremony for its unveiling, but safety concerns precluded this. First, foundry workers sliced apart the monument into pieces small enough to fit into their crucible, and then heated up these pieces before dropping them in to melt. Finally, the bronze was poured into molds, and these ingots now await the next stage of creation as they raise funds for the new work. Schmidt and Douglas and the others who spent years fighting to destroy the monument didn't think that their actions would trouble General Lee in the afterlife. They committed this iconoclasm because the statue was put up to show official support for eugenicist, racist, white supremacist ideas, and its continued presence at the heart of the city continued to show that these ideas were at least tolerated by the authorities. The lawsuits and rallies seeking to defend the Lee Monument showed that some Virginians did very much want these ideas to keep being part of public life. but the final destruction of the statue proved that these people no longer had the power to impose their beliefs on all of the citizens of Charlottesville. So what would it mean, I wonder, to commit similar acts of iconoclasm against a generative AI image? There are plenty of people who are concerned with the ideas that motivate the creation and promulgation of such AI technologies. And iconoclasm could be a strategy to fight the dominance of any of these ideas. Just to give one to think about as an example, I am concerned with the idea that many people seem to have that artificial intelligence is somehow better or more powerful than human intelligence, that it is somehow superhuman, whether technologically or supernaturally. But while we can delete an AI image or refuse to generate one or mock one for errors and differences from reality, these forms of action aren't iconoclasm, I would argue, because they do not attack the power that created the AI image in a way that Melting Down Lee attacked the power of the political use of the idea of white supremacy. Committing iconoclasm against an AI image is especially tricky because the linkages between the image and the power generating it are not clear. Like dreams, AI images are produced by a human mind without being controlled by it, at least not fully. There's a black box between the original engineering that went into creating the technology and the way the technology operates. So when contemplating this feature, this black box of AI images, I began to think about similarities with spirit photography. Spiritualists believe that the spirits of the dead retain not only something of their living identities, but also the power to impinge upon the world of the living, usually through the assistance of especially sensitive people known as mediums or psychics or clairvoyants. Beginning in the 1850s, as soon as photography is invented, spiritualists describe seeing translucent figures appearing in photographs where they had not been visible in the scene photographed, and thought that these were the spirits of the dead appearing. But it wasn't really until the 1860s and 70s that photographers in Europe and America began offering in bulk spirit photography, giving clients the opportunity to pose for a portrait in which an image of their beloved departed might appear. Those who had lost someone in the American Civil War or one of the European conflicts of the era proved especially eager to pay for this possibility of reconnection. Humans have, of course, always been hungry for images that would provide guidance from some superhuman intelligence, whether this was the deity or a spirit of a dead person who had gained otherworldly wisdom from the afterlife. Many cultures have hit upon forms of divination that rely on reading forms from a formless prompt to provide this wisdom. Thus, ancient Babylonian priests asked questions of the gods, sacrificed a sheep, and tried to read their answers from the lumps and fibers and nodes in its liver. They even tried to systematize this horoscopy by preserving models of livers in clay, like this one, and recording on them what happened after a particular form appeared to match omens to events. And many people continue to practice tasseography, the reading of tea leaves, essentially a vegetarian version of the same idea. Manuals promise to help anyone spot symbols in the tea leaves and then reveal their meanings. The frustration, of course, of naturally occurring random forms is that they are very rarely as satisfyingly representational as is, say, the heart implausibly made from tea leaves shown on the cover to the right. It's all too easy to slip out of your belief into a realization that the meaning of the vague image you see is being produced by you, the viewer, instead of by supernatural agency. Spirit photography, though, promised a solution, a clear, unambiguous image that allowed you to not only, for example, see your dead wife, then know she was still thinking of you, how King Llewellyn might have enjoyed this, but also to receive advice from her. I found the "oh" in this "oh, don't," presumably written by the spirits in response to a question of whether or not the sitter should do something, to be both touching and hilarious. Believers thought that these images or writings were imposed upon the film by spirits, usually when called up into communication by mediums. Some mediums began to work with photography. Some photographers professed to be mediums. Some mediums retrained as photographers to allow the spirits to make their marks. Skeptics, of course, nearly immediately pointed out that these spirit photographs seemed to be the product of very human manipulations, whether by drawing on the plates, posing with actors portraying ghosts, or deceiving unsuspecting clients by taking double exposures. First a short one to capture a fuzzy, vague image of a spirit, and later one of normal length on the same plate to capture the sitter, who could then watch the plate be developed and see, they thought, the image appear from nowhere. Opportunities for trickery were rife, since many mediums demanded that their clients deliver packages of film or photographic plates to them days in advance so they could magnetize them with spiritual energy. Nothing suspicious about that at all. Believers, though, proved very capable of explaining away the most seemingly devastating of these appearances of fraud. For example, when it was pointed out that the photograph I'm showing you here on the right of a medium and a spirit was obviously produced via double exposure, with the medium wrapping himself in a sheet to play the role of ghosts, spiritualists countered with the assertion that, of course, the medium and the spirit looked alike because the spirit was that of his astral body. Others explained that the technique used to produce photographs like this was indeed double exposure, but said it was the spirits who were doing the second exposure. Some even held seances to ask the spirits themselves to weigh in on the debates. In one seance, the spirits rather haughtily explained that they arranged for light entering the camera lens to pass through a mixed aura, whose refractions often cause things to be apparent on the plate which you cannot account for. Despite these ridiculousnesses, spirit photography got an immense boost in credibility in 1895 when a German scientist discovered a form of radiation that he dubbed X-rays, capable of producing images that revealed bones through flesh. X-rays, of course, proved immediately interesting to physicians and other scientists, but they were also fascinating to spiritualists because at last here was proof that invisible rays could penetrate the visible to unveil the unknown. Soon, the power of mediums was explained as that they possessed a spiritual X-ray apparatus connected to their sense of sight, so that objects hidden to ordinary eyes are exposed by astral light, and the resulting images are photographed on their brains. One writer described mediums' sight as X-gazes. The belief that photography mechanically and automatically captured a scene led to a new trend in spirit photography, where photographers attempted to prove the reality of the manifestations that occurred during seances. A German physician named Albert von Schrenck-Notzing was an especially prominent proponent for photography as what he called an objective recording of phenomena, believing that while the senses of participants in seances could be deceived, photographs could produce positive proof. Schrenck-Notzing took and published an extensive series of photographs of the medium known as Eva C., who produced a substance known as ectoplasm from her mouth or between her legs. Oop, I think I skipped. Oh no, I just deleted one by accident. Okay. She produced from her mouth or between her legs while entering a trance state during a seance. This ectoplasm would sometimes expand to reveal the image of a human face. And interpretations of what ectoplasm was varied, by the way. For some believers, it was produced by the spirits seeking to manifest themselves, while others believed it was an emanation of the medium's consciousness, allowing participants to see what she saw, what the spirits were telling her. While seances were traditionally conducted in low light, the ectoplasm of Eva C. sometimes also took the form of limbs. So here she is covered with hands. While seances were traditionally conducted in low light or total darkness, photography, of course, required light. Eva continued to conduct most of her proceedings in darkness and spent most of her time during them in a special curtained-off area, which she called her cabinet, shut off from the participants, only occasionally emerging to show phenomenon. Like most of the mediums who agreed to allow cameras into the room, she complained that the flash required to take a photograph would hurt her eyes and disturb and scare away the spirits, so she would occasionally signal to the waiting photographer that it was time to take a photograph and trigger the flash. In other cases, the spirits helpfully themselves communicated that the time was ripe by a series of prearranged knocking sounds, for example. In the most exciting cases, Eva's ectoplasm assumed the shape of faces. Skeptics pointed out that these faces looked inescapably two-dimensional, and some even showed what seemed to be folded lines or crumpled surfaces, as if they were made of paper rather than spirit. It wasn't difficult to think that Eva had simply cut an image out of a magazine and secretly brought it into the seance to produce. Some fraudulent mediums in the period even confessed that this is what they were doing, that they manufactured their own ectoplasm from various components, including, most grossly, cotton wool soaked in goose fat that would be held in the mouth. Schrenck-Notzing reacted to such skepticism by pointing out the measures he had taken to ensure that the mediums he studied hadn't smuggled in any substances. Here we see his photographs of another medium who's been trussed up in a garment that she cannot reach under, with her head and hands enclosed in a net, which didn't prevent her from producing ectoplasm from her mouth, which apparently passed through the netting, Schrenck-Notzing claimed, without disturbing it. Eva C. even agreed to participate in some seances with female observers only in the nude. In one of these, she produced her only full-length manifestation. Here we see her opening the curtains of her cabinet to show that she is accompanied by a ghost. Schrenck-Notzing presented a modified version of this photograph. His decision to black out Eva's breasts and pudenda seemed to indicate an aversion to thinking too closely about the female body, one shared by many polite believers of the era, which allowed female mediums to bring faux ectoplasmic and other substances into seances in their vaginas. I am most interested in Schrenck-Notzing's photographs because of the debate that ensued when he published this one, showing what seems to be a few printed letters on one of Eva's manifestations. Skeptics noted that the text looked a whole lot like the title of the French publication Les Miroirs, which often ran large portraits of celebrities on its cover. They combed through past issues and soon found a number of cover images that resembled those Eva had manifested, including various actresses and even the American president Woodrow Wilson. The images were different, but the differences seemed to be caused by someone modifying them by coloring over them, as here where Woodrow Wilson has been given a mustache that brings out an unexpected resemblance to Groucho Marx. Even Eva's most impressive manifestation seemed to be a photograph of the King of Bulgaria. But Schrenck-Notzing remained a believer. He and other spiritualists denied that the images that appeared during these seances were those printed in Les Miroirs. Instead, they explained that Eva had seen Les Miroirs hanging in the newsstands and then manifested images she remembered from its cover. The seance images were thus, quote, genuine in their phantasmagorical apparition. Other believers posited that perhaps the reproductions of already existing images were due to the difficulty spirits evidently found in communicating with the living, and took a lot of energy. It must be easier for these invisible artists to represent themselves by the use of a model taken from an existing image rather than manifest their own portraits. Such arguments are unfalsifiable. Even more absurdly, a similar defense was raised earlier when in 1905, Eva C., then working under a different name, produced a manifestation of a bearded ghost in a seance that convinced a Nobel Prize-winning physiologist of her powers. Skeptics pointed out that the phantom's beard looked fake, and one of her defenders conceded that it was indeed a fake beard and worn by the medium herself, but still argued that no fraud had occurred. Instead, an intelligence from beyond had directed the medium to bring and don the false beard and clothes so she could represent its spirit. All of this shows that the most credulous, that the true creator of a spirit photograph is the credulous viewer. It's their intelligence that creates the link between image and reality. This is probably true of all images that seek to convince viewers of non-obvious truths, but it's especially true in debates surrounding artificial intelligence. I think I have been thinking of Eva C's false beard, for example, when another story breaks revealing that yet another startup is actually using human labor to produce what it is represented as AI results. And defenders spring up to say, well, that AI technology will soon be able to do what's promised, even if it isn't there just yet. I've also been thinking of ways in which to convince people to reevaluate their understandings of the powers and capabilities of AI images. How can we commit iconoclasm against these slippery images if believers are as gymnastic in their manipulations of understanding as were the spiritualists? I look here for inspiration to the great stage magician Harry Houdini, who knew a thing or two about the manipulation of perception and who fought a long battle against fraudulent psychics whom he saw as preying on the hearts and pocketbooks of people mourning their dead. Houdini wrote eloquently about fraud and its causes, but more importantly, he grasped an essential truth about iconoclasm, that if it is to be effective, the iconoclasts cannot merely destroy images, they must also create new replacement images that represent the power of their beliefs. This is why, for example, the Swords into Plowshares project created both the ingots and beautiful photographs of the ingots and of the process of melting. This is why, as the scholar Aaron Tugendhaft has argued in his wonderful book, The Idols of Isis, the members of the Islamic State didn't merely smash images they deemed heretical, but made sure to capture images of themselves doing so to upload to the internet. At Iraq's Mosul Museum, for example, the Islamic State members not only filmed themselves smashing pre-Islamic statues, but then edited the footage together, adding commentary and a catchy soundtrack. These self-proclaimed iconoclast destroyers of images created new images that ironically preserved, if at least in digital form, the artworks they had physically destroyed so that they could perpetuate the sight of them being destroyed. The anthropological theorist Michael Taussig has also helped me understand the importance of such rituals in his book Defacement, which explains that some images bear what he would call a public secret, something that is privately known but collectively denied. This public secret could be that the spirits that appear during masked dances are actually the men of the tribe playing a role, or that a Confederate monument erected at the height of the Jim Crow period was intended not to honor the memory of the Civil War, but to entrench a system of racial hierarchy. Taussig argues that merely revealing this secret doesn't do anything because people already know it and often are interested in the power given to them by keeping it. Taussig argues that public secrets must be transformed through a desacralizing ceremony or revelation if they are to be destroyed. Similarly, Houdini realized that he couldn't simply gather information about psychics by attending seances. Here's him in disguise to do so by figuring out their tricks and describing them dispassionately to readers. Instead, he knew that he needed to put on performances to convince audiences using the same processes that fooled believers to convert them into skeptics. Essentially, he would perform seances with the lights on. Here he shows how mediums can fool a seance participant, convincing them that they're not moving their hands and feet when actually withdrawing their foot from a shoe held tight under the foot of the participant and using their toes to ring a bell, which was thought to be magically the spirits communicating using the sound of bells. Can there be similar replacement images deployed by skeptics of AI? So my last few slides here to show you that I think yes. I'm closing with this project, Taking Stock, by the artist, New York artist Michael Mandelberg. To perform this project, Mandelberg downloaded stock images, which form a substantial proportion of the training set of most current generative AI systems. Mandelberg wanted to examine these photographs to see how AI is seeing us, what biases and distortions are built into its stock training data. Mandelberg's work points out, for example, that the global economics of the stock imagery trade means that most stock photography studios are in Eastern Europe, which leads to an overrepresentation of white bodies in these photographs even before the deliberate choices of the photographers come in. Mandelberg also thinks about the effect of using the images, images created for advertisements to train AI. This means that AI systems think it's much more probable that we assume expressions in everyday life that are really only seen in ads, Mandelberg expresses these insights not only in text, but also in striking images that they produce by merging stock photography images labeled with the same identifiers to show how strikingly uniform and they really are. And it's images like this that I think can be seen as iconoclasm directed against AI. And with that declaration, I look forward to opening this discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So raise your hand and let us know if you want to speak. Jan, you want to distribute the microphone? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. That was incredibly rich. So at various points, when, after laying out a very clear and elaborate case for a particular type of modern use of iconoclasm, right? So against this background, then at various points, in particular the black box argument, right, pointed out that the type of image that we're dealing with in the age of AI, does not fit into this history that you were telling. And then there was at least one moment of a type of conceptual iconoclasm when you also, I think, quite rightly pointed out the very limitations of the technology, right? Fancy autocomplete, the black box problem, et cetera, et cetera. So would you say then, in sum, that, your talk, this paper can be read as showing that there's a historical shift and that iconoclasm, as we know it, does not yet fully have a grip on what's happening? Or do you think the contours of an iconoclasm in the age of AI are already visible from, recent events of iconoclasm?
Thank you also for attributing much more coherence to my thought than it probably actually possesses. I don't want to say that the AI image is a new type of image. I think like various forms of divination, it comes out of the same desire that we feel to produce something that we can then deny having produced. But I think that iconoclasm has not turned its attention to that sort of image yet. So I think it can, but it will take a swerve in either our understanding of what those images are or iconoclasm's understanding of its power.
Zach?
Hi, thank you. Great talk. And I actually study philosophy of magic, and so this has been right up my alley. And immediately, Houdini is the easy go-to example, but I'm also thinking here of Alexander Herman and his feud with Distabar, right? And how they went back and forth, developing these shows that was, Herman exposing her, and then her coming up with new methods of, deception, and then they would go back and forth until eventually she was imprisoned for fraud and extortion, right? And I think what's maybe deeper than even the economic dimension here is the moral dimension, that, at best, some people lost a few bucks to a, fraud medium, and at worst, they lost a very deep connection that they thought they had with a past loved one, right? And so I'm curious in, the direction you're going with AI, if there are similar moral implications and what kind of violence of exposure you foresee coming out of that.
Well, and then the ethics of this debates are so interesting too, because in the case of magicians and psychics, by publicizing their methods, I think it's indisputable that Houdini's publications were read by people who then thought, well, I can do that as fraud. And then by psychics who said, well, if I figure out something different, I can say, well, I'm not that kind of fraudster, I am authentic. So there is this symbiotic relationship of iconoclast and iconodual, of exposure and exposed. And I'm sure there will be one with AI as well. In the form I see so far is the hardening of hype belief, that the more you attack people who defend AI, the more they become defenders. But this is maybe because I'm experiencing this on various social media platforms that take a certain point of view or another. And this is why I think figuring out what are people's core motivations, what are their desires that are leading them to embark upon this behavior is more useful for changing the behavior than doing higher level quibbling about what or is not possible. Which is why I brought up, the mockery of you can look at 1,000 images generated by AI and say this one has too many fingers, we don't have that many knees, whatever. But that's not going to stop the AI defenders from defending the power of that technology.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was sort of wondering. So we began with the king who can't tell, thinks his dreams are real. In the case of the spirit photography, it's that there's a kind of attempt to say this, a disavowal of the thing that you had just made. But I'm wondering with AI, on the flip side, for particularly artists who get very upset about the proliferation of AI images, and those of us who are really on guard for AI images, the way in which sometimes the misrecognition goes the other way. I have seen cases where someone has genuinely produced a work with no reference to AI, but it has some of the things that people take as the potential tells, and then the actual artist is put in the position of having to defend themselves to people who would usually consume their art as non-AI. And that seems maybe something a functionally weirdly different phenomenon, unless it turned out tomorrow there was one of these spirit photography cases where the ghost was really there, and because of our skepticism of all the other spirit photography images, we neglected to realize that there was one place where the ghost was really there. So I wonder what you made of this way in which the going of the other way, the blurring of the lines that create the possibility for the misrecognition of real image, and real image, I mean, in the sense of non-AI generated image, and the iconoclast ending up destroying even that too in the attempt to take down AI generated images.
Yeah, and this argument, not that I'm saying that you're a spiritualist, but was used by spiritualists who were saying that even if there's one genuine spirit photograph, that justifies all of the rest of it. And they also interestingly used the conditions of photography to talk about skepticism. So there was plenty of people who said, why are you doing the seances in the dark? Just do this with the lights on so we can all see. And then some people take to saying, well, would you ask a photographer to work in the light? To develop their photographs in the light? No. So don't ask spiritualists to work in the light. So there are always endless ways of phrasing the argument to defend your point of view by pointing at the baby who might or may not be in the bathwater. I think of that type of problem of mistaking an image for something it's not in connection to both the looting of archaeological sites and sales of antiquities without any information about where they came from, and a forgery in general. I am continually incredulous that people consume images without wanting to know more about their creation or documentation or history. Maybe this is just because I'm such a dyed-in-the-wool historian, but I think asking, wait, where did this come from? Tell me more about how this was made, is a good question for all art consumption.
Charlotte?
Okay, now, first of all, thank you for your talk, and I thought it was super interesting, and especially the story about the spirit photography, I think, really showed how people have kind of always praised on nostalgia and deep emotions to get money out of people. And you touched on people believing that they are like in a relationship with their AI. Do you think it makes a difference that for the spirit photography, for example, there was not really the spirit that could justify them being there and like talk to the people, but with AI, if someone who feels like they have like a relationship with the AI and they can talk to the AI and also say like, oh, people are criticizing this, or people are saying you are not real, and then the AI itself can defend itself in that relationship. What would you make of that difference? Because to me, it seems like that is a very, very drastic step from, for example, spirit photography or other forms of spirituality, where you get like maybe indirect messages from the spiritual world, but not clear sentences like AI can provide to people.
I think AI is more chatty, but the substance of the interactions can be very similar. You know, you're making me think that it wasn't just asking the spirits about spirit photography, but so many seances had people asking the spirits, you know, tell us more about where you came from. How can you come here? What are your powers? People say they don't believe this or that. And then, you know, the spirits would be producing new information or explanations, or saying, well, I can do this now, so that should prove whatever. Or, you know, tell everybody that next week I'm going to have the medium do something super awesome. So I think there's actually more of this built-in feedback loop that convinces the credulous. And you might say, well, in spiritualism, it's a fraudulent medium fooling somebody else. But there's super fascinating cases of mediums who seem to entirely believe their own hype, who are fooling themselves, even when people are skeptical. So yeah, I think there are more similarities than differences, although it is important to me that you can spend so long, and people who get into these delusional states often talk about losing sleep. And so if you're doing something 20 hours a day, you're gonna react more differently than just a seance or two a week.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating. And just from a philosophical point of view, I would just remind everybody about Kant's Träume eines Geistessehers, the dreams of a spirit seer, where he actually comes very close initially to almost endorsing some of the claims of Swedenborg. So even the great Kant can come close to being fooled. But what I wanted to delve into a bit more deeply is kind of the relation between the two segments of your talk in terms of the monuments to a racist heritage in the United States, and then today with AI and an iconoclasm towards AI. Do you see descendants in, for example, in the technology world, do you see descendants of the same kinds of pseudosciences that underlay the eugenics? I mean, I can't remember the man's name, but the person who just published the history of Stanford wrote about the deep connections between Stanford and eugenics and so forth. And Marcus Gabriel yesterday talked about Stanford as the site for very disturbing readings of Heidegger. So just how are there connections that we can draw of the underlying pseudosciences that ground some of this?
Yes, definitely. I will charitably say, though, that I think much of our lives is run by pseudoscience. Science is hard to understand. Pseudoscience is very seductive in its simplicity and offering of things we want versus the things that are. So, but more specifically, yeah, there's a very disturbing trend among a lot of tech executives to have sort of optimized birth, to control through artificial insemination, through sometimes they come right out and say, you know, these are the type of people who should be having children, and therefore I will have a lot of them, versus, you know, they don't usually say the versus other people shouldn't be having children, but you kind of get the idea. You know, there's only going to be so much room on the spaceships to Mars, for example. But I think that much more concerningly are the unrecognized racial discrimination phenomena built into our technology. So with the stock photography and generative AI, the idea that the AI algorithm thinks, in heavy quotation marks, that a much higher percentage of the population is white is problematic, affects its representation of the world back to us. And then the question is, are we impacted by that representation? Which I think we are, which is why I care about monuments at all, right? Because monuments are there to show you who is the type of person that deserves honor in our community. So, I don't know, AI is going to show you who's the type of person who deserves to have a new iPhone in your community or something like that. But I still think that anytime the representation departs from reality is of interest, especially when it's done in a systematic way.
Thank you so much for this very important and really fascinating talk. My question is in some respects similar to what Charlotte asked earlier, but it seems to me that the power landscape here is really complex. And if I understood your definition of iconoclasm correctly, such that iconoclasm attacks power by proxy, where the image is the proxy for that. It seems to me that in the case of AI, Charlotte was mentioning the cases of, say, people falling in love with AI or becoming friends with AI. That seems to me like a really complex layer, as though, those who are behind the curtain of AI, right? Programmers, executives, are in some sense indirectly influencing the emotional lives of people to such an extent that they are deluded into thinking, I have this real relationship, or, as we have seen in the past few weeks, commit suicide. They're emotionally that wrapped up with this. But it's also the case, right, that as this taking stock project exposes, there's programmer bias, that's a certain register of power at work here, and another is just capitalist accumulation, right? So given these different registers in which power needs to be attacked, I'm wondering, how can iconoclasm address this really complex imbrication of power adequately? One might think, okay, well, we're just going to need a lot of iconoclastic projects, but would that be too diffuse? I ask that because the other cases you brought up, right, the movement when it was really common to be talking about removing Confederate statues, or, ISIS was very unified in the idea of, this is how we're going to destroy museum art, this is the kind of work we're attacking. There's a unity to the project of iconoclasm here. But I'm wondering, can there be a unity to the project of iconoclasm in this context? Hopefully that made sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't think there I don't see one currently. I think iconoclasm, everybody feels the urge to destroy images that they don't like. I mean, anybody who's ever like taken down a photo of an X from your refrigerator, that's how it works. And I think the only reason we aren't smashing statues all the time is that it takes this political unity, which is hard. And that's one reason why I went really deeply into the logistics of the Charlottesville removal, because it took Andrea Douglas and Jillian Smith years of their life to take down one statue where the city council and the majority of the people agreed with them. So if this is what happens when things are going right, it is extremely difficult when there's any sort of disagreement. So yeah, I don't see an emerging consensus about AI, whether pro or con yet, but I still think that iconoclastic-esque projects can play a role, in part because these type of projects express the anger that other reactions do not.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I had a question about materiality, because in the beginning, if I wrote it down correctly, you said that it's about an intangible idea that is attacked through a tangible object. So would you say that the unease with AI comes from the fact that there's somehow less tangibility and less materiality? And I don't know, I just had to think about NFTs, so NFT art, whether this might be whether the unease there is the same as for just generated images, or whether there's a difference because it has the possibility of destruction if the key is destroyed.
Yeah, I think so. That is part of the root of the difficulty. But I also think that photography is itself an example of the possibility of attacks on something that it's not the prime or the sole reference. So we do have ways of attacking images that don't destroy the possibility of replication. So I think there could be digital equivalents of this, in part just by pointing out, perhaps like in the case of NFTs, how impermanent they really are when they claim to be permanent.
Okay, yes. Thank you. It's very rich lecture. So my question is, I usually ask questions from different angles. I don't know whether it's possible. So it seems to me that, your analogy with the spirit photography hinges on the viewer being deceived by the supposed reality, right? But in Japan, we see the powerful form of belief directed to an entity that are openly and celebritately artificial, like a virtual idol, Miku, like those things. So her fans don't believe she is a real human spirit. They believe in her as an icon, knowing she's just a quote, like some quote, right? So how does this phenomenon challenge the idea that debunking the public secret is a key to iconoclasms? When the secret of artificiality is not a secret to be exposed, but is the very source of the icon's power, then what form can critique or protest possible take? This is my question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think so. Tausig talks about attempts of Christian missionaries to convince people they're trying to proselytize to that they're what the missionaries are calling their idols are not actually gods, that the spirits that appear are just masked members of the tribes, and how in brilliant defenses against this unmasking, even if the missionaries confiscate the masks or break the idols, that the people who still believe will say, well, the spirits left that mask or left that idol before you could destroy it. So that doesn't count. That's not an unmasking. And I'm thinking also that Tugendhaft in the Idols of Isis mentions that in the Quran, the prophet Abraham is said to have gone into a shrine attempting to convert people to the worship of Allah, and broken all of the idols, the statues in the shrine, except for the largest one. And then when the people said, "Why did you break all of the idols?" He said, "Well, I didn't break him. It was the big one did it. He broke all the other ones." And then they're like, "Are you nuts? Idols can't move." And he's like, "Aha! Why are you worshiping something that can't move?" So yeah, there are all these interesting maneuvers to take about belief, which is why it's so fascinating to me what people read into images and what they believe about them changes what they can see when those images are changed.
Yeah, thank you so much. As a fellow lover of historical oddities and esoteric, I was from Llewellyn to the spirit photography I was living, so thank you so much. My question is, well, I guess I'm going to try to maybe trace how I kind of interpreted your argument or your presentation, and then pose a question. So it seemed like you were kind of giving us a series of historical examples of iconoclasm that to me seemed like they were maybe specifically examples of damnatio memoriae, like the condemnation of memory, which is often distinct from, or I think considered distinctly from, iconoclasm as the attacking of any kind of images whatsoever, simply because images ought not to exist for, religious reasons or some other kind of, belief-oriented moral or ethical idea about imagery being problematic. But then it seems like the spirit photography bit kind of was maybe like almost a literalization or a visualization of Tausig's argument, which is that what seems like the destruction of, say, a specific individual is actually the symbolic destruction of a certain kind of system of power or something like this. And so it actually is more like traditional iconoclasm, in that, a certain kind of image ought not to exist, rather than this person needs to be erased from the face of the earth in this representation specifically, or in all other ones, because of their specificity as a person. But I wonder then, there's still, in all of the cases that we looked at up until AI, it still seems like there's kind of a justification or a linkage between the actual visual object that's destroyed and the system of power. You you provided elaborate justifications for the iconoclasm against the Robert E. Lee statue, both because of, Lee as a figure, despite his own personal qualms, as well as the system. So it seems like there's still a linkage there, whereas with AI, I wonder, should all AI images be equally available for iconoclasm, or is it specific images? Or is it kind of more of a problem of just the fact that AI images exists, or if we see a certain one, do we want to delete that one?
I think that I would say that distinction is not one I see so intensely between attacking a specific person through images and holding that a certain type of images don't exist. Because if you think that a certain type of images don't exist, just don't make them or don't look at them. Why? There's an additional motivation for destroying that type of image. And I think mostly iconoclasts do that because they think that someone else is taking advantage of that type of image to have power or wealth that they shouldn't have. So that the priests are collecting money from visiting pilgrims who want to have themselves cured by use of this supposedly miraculous image, so we're going to attack that image. Especially, I would say, in the case of the Islamic State, they are saying that they're anti-image, that it's usurping the role of Allah to create this image, but then they clearly don't believe that fully because they were only smashing a certain type of image and then selling the other ones to gain profit. So they were smashing the ones that were too recognizable or had been too publicly exposed to be sold. So I would say that strict religious belief was not the motivating idea. I think people are always using images to get at other people, to take things away or impose things upon them. And then it depends what you feel about AI. I would say as a class, but then again, that's just me being grumpy. So maybe, there are certain types of people who are more concerned with certain types of AI images, like there's been a couple of outcries in recent years about people who are colorizing images, or just, okay, let's think about like 2 weeks ago, there were people who are getting paid by Facebook because they're getting a lot of clicks. So the more clicks on something, the more likes you get, the more eyes are on it, the more Facebook rewards you as an affiliate for attracting eyes who will also look at advertisements. And so they were getting these clicks by using AI to generate photographs from inside concentration camps. Of like someone playing the violin or someone looking sad, whatever. So there are very few photographs from inside an operating concentration camp in World War II, and people were fascinated by this, and there was an outcry of this was misrepresenting history and just pretty gross. So yeah, I would say there are types of AI-generated images that are far grosser than others, but I'm uncomfortable with all of them, but not through any worked out philosophical justification, just through an intuitive ick so far.
Yeah, thank you once again. I was especially impressed by your first part of the talk with the taking down of the Robert E. Lee monument as an example for modern iconoclasm. So I had to think about yesterday while I was doom scrolling in bed, as we all do. I saw a reel of a family here in America who's living very close to a data center that's like where all the servers for example, ChatGPT are built. So what I was thinking is, for the first time, I feel we really have to distinguish between like software and hardware, because back in the day you would destroy a physical monument and that would be considered iconoclasm. But I feel for the first time we really have to think about this distinction in a way. So what I wanted to ask, would you consider, like, I don't know, for example, because you said that just deleting an AI image is not really iconoclastic, would you consider, I don't know, committing arson to one of these data centers iconoclastic?
Oh, that's an interesting idea, especially because you're making me think that this is another form of discrimination built into tech, where these power-hungry, water-contaminating data centers are often, at least in the US, being built in minority neighborhoods. Yet another form of redlining and et cetera. So yeah, an attack on the potential of the image maybe could, or some sort of an introduction of a virus into the system that impacts the way images are created. I don't know. So many possibilities with new technology.
Well, I mean, I'll since I'm holding the microphone and we're at the end, I'll ask a last question that builds on yours, Zelini, which is, it seems to me, and also what you said, Abby, that and almost everything you've said, Erin, there's a kind of, at least it seems to me, there's a kind of slippage between image destruction, which is, I guess, what iconoclasm means, image deletion, image obscuration or obfuscation, and so forth. In other words, there are different ways that things can be removed from view. And I wonder what we could say that's specific to the idea of the destruction of an image, as opposed to simply its removal from view in non-destructive ways. I think deleting counts like that. I mean, as you pointed out, deleting, might take it off the refrigerator or off my computer, but it's, I suppose you could take the photo of your X and destroy it. That would be a different act to simply removing it from the fridge. And,
like Sinead O'Connor and the Pope.
Yeah, for example. Exactly. Just like Sinead O'Connor and the Pope. Exactly. Which helps me ask my question, which is I think destruction is as theological a category as the thing that it tries to negate, which is creation. I don't know that what I'm saying is true, but I'm putting this out as a thought, right? That what destruction targets is something's having been created at all. That's why the server would be the interesting target, and why fire or tearing up or some bombing or whatever looks right to us. And what makes iconoclasm not only but in some sense the religious cultural practice is it assumes that destruction negates creation, that it goes to the core of the thing, so to speak, if you see what I'm getting at, as opposed to simply removing it from view. And so, let me put this in the specifics of what you presented. When what you're calling modern day iconoclasm of removing monuments happens, sometimes, as you pointed out, they're destroyed, although in very elegant ways, being melted down or whatever, turned into pieces. And sometimes they're just simply picked up and trucked out to some other state and put there, or stuck in storage for a while, like the end of the first Indiana Jones movie. You just put it in a box and keep it in the factory. So I wonder if you could say, if you have some thoughts about the specificity of destruction as a religious idea. If I can just tuck in one other thought around this. Embodiment has become one of the philosophical buzzwords of the last 10 years. And when I read secondary literature on embodiment questions, I often find it very hard to distinguish it from the religious idea of incarnation. Which was a theme in your paper, that it's embodying some kind of non-bodily X, often called agency. but there's other names for it. In other words, it's very hard to get at something as just simply embodiment without incarnation. And iconoclasm tries to aim at that 0 degree by destroying something physically. And this is the Japanese thought, it seems to me, as well as the Byzantine thought. You're destroying body and soul, or as it were, you're showing there's no difference. It's not representative, it's the thing, right? It's the God itself. That's why it's such a powerful thing to do.
I think iconoclasm is a powerful thing to do, but I don't think that iconoclasts confuse destruction with negation. I think there's a small but important difference in that what iconoclasm does is show that a thing is capable of destruction, or that it's rejection, let's say, rather than destruction. So, even when you rip up the photograph of your ex, you remember what they look like. Newsflash, we still know what Gita looked like, even despite Caracola's best efforts. To commit iconoclasm is not to entirely erase something from memory, because memory and representation are different. But I think iconoclasm is becoming more important as an idea now because of what you were talking about with the attention economy. Now that it is possible to see so many things, we have to think about, well, what of these things is it right that we should be seeing and preserving? I'm thinking, for example, of ongoing debates about what it's appropriate to display in museums. So it's my fault that the American Museum of Natural History no longer displays human remains, because they had been thinking about it for a long time. They're on the fence, and then I wrote an article looking into the history of how they had gotten a lot of these remains, which was absolutely horrific. And they're like, okay, we're calling uncle. We're taking them off display, but not significantly declaring we're giving them all back or we're burying them, where they've declared that they're open to claims being made.
Are there still the diorama of the Japanese there?
Because
Because I would take those down too.
I think the cultural halls, several of them are being renovated. You can go and see which ones they consider the most problematic in a sort of chain, because some of them they've put up paper in front of, like this is entirely irredeemable. Some of them they've just turned off the lights so you can kind of see inside. Apparently the problem is exacerbated by the fact that when they constructed these dioramas, they sealed the glass and they're custom shaped panes. So it's not just a matter of you can take off the glass and go in and rearrange things a little bit. You have to break the glass and then hire somebody to make a new pane. So it's at least $20,000 to make any changes, apparently. So it's a huge project, and people want to give money to dinosaurs rather than this. But there are also questions about what sort of sacralities are appropriate to display, who should interpret the things, who should write the signage. So yeah, all these questions to me are connected about technology has given us these powers. The history of capitalism and colonialism has spread these objects around, but what is appropriate to do now that we can think about it for just a minute?
Well, thank you very much. It was a great discussion. So this officially concludes this chapter, anyway, of the Institute for Philosophy and the New Humanities Fall Seminar, which this year has, I guess we could say, 2 parts. So we're all going to meet again, and I think we should sit in the very same order when we meet again in Japan in 2 weeks' time, at least a number of us. Marcus and Zed, do you want to say some final words for the camera? Or is it
Zed wants to say it.
Okay.
No, Marcus, you talk for
Well, then maybe, okay, so then I'll just say a few words. First of all, also, thanks to, all the speakers, who stayed with us throughout the week, gave important papers, contributing to the substance, of course, fundamentally of this workshop format. Then thanks also to the New School for hosting this. And at this point, for every human, not so much behind the curtain, but operating here, making this possible. So thanks to all the organizers, in particular also to Jan and Alex, who do this throughout the entire year.
Thank you, Jan and Alex.
And then in Kyoto, we'll continue very soon, looking at the social ontology of AI. So, what is it to think of AI systems as part of larger social, including economic, political, etc., formations, rather than think about the software, the hardware, or the thing. Right, so that's going to be an important topic, and I do assume that, the issue, and I want to flag that I think this is something to look for also in the future. There was an interesting, through line, I think, in this week. Many things were happening, but one through line was that everybody in one way or another commented on this, effective turn in the use of AI, and it's quite interesting that this level of emotions showed up as we were discussing images. Why we did very specifically want to focus after we did language, last year, and meaning on the, imagistic side of Gen AI. It turned out we started speaking about emotions at very important moments. So I think that's diagnostic somehow of something in the present moment. And we shall continue also discussing that in Kyoto. So thanks again to everybody, and also, of course, to the great fellows whom we were able to convince to join us this year. Actually, you applied and we selected you because you were great, so that's how we convinced you. And and now I think we are going to the Walker Hotel, unless the vice president wants to say something, which does not make me the president, just him the vice president.
We don't have presidents.
There were a lot of J.D. Vance thoughts running through my head.
Yeah, well, exactly. I was finally.
I mean, here's a way of destroying an image that we haven't talked about in the AI era. Where's Erin? It involves replacing the actual accurate image of someone with the parody image, and of course that is what everyone was trying to do with all of these garbage pail kids images of J.D. Vance. It's to for our historical memory, give us a very different way of thinking about
Gavin Newsom.
who he is. So I think that's a way of thinking about a kind of AI version of some of these themes. But here's what I want to end with from my point of view. This seminar, which obviously takes a lot of work and but is really fun while we're all here together. One measure of the success of this kind of enterprise for me depends on something that you all go on to do now. So we've really tried to expose you to a lot of people whose work we think is really interesting and important to know about. We've also tried to expose you to a lot of problems that we think people should be talking about, thinking about more than they currently seem to be. Hence our attempt to connect this very ancient idea from the history of human thought with today's AI age. So one measure of our success as a group is if some of you hopefully go on to actually write something based on what we've brought to the table. So we really hope you will continue talking about that with us, but then take this as a jumping off point for your own research. And so please keep us in the loop if that is something that you go on to do. So our success depends on you in that sense.
Yep.
So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.